You meet someone new, or perhaps reunite with old friends, or come into closer contact with colleagues, and suddenly everything feels alive. You feel connected, wanted, and chosen. Maybe for the first time in a long time, you begin imagining, in the case of a new romantic relationship, the possibility of different feelings, maybe even a different future. Then something shifts. Maybe you meet their family. Maybe you become more aware of their success, confidence, lifestyle, or wealth. Suddenly, instead of feeling close, alive, and connected, you feel exposed. At this critical moment, you have a few options. One option is that you start pulling away. You stay engaged, but at a distance, because psychologically, this is your, and I quote, exit strategy. You become distant, irritated, and emotionally unavailable. On the surface, you may insist that you don't care. But what if I told you that your aloofness, your superiority, your bragging, your, and I quote, defensiveness is happening precisely because you do care? Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're going to discuss one of the most misunderstood psychological conflicts in narcissistic relationships, and I quote, the fear of dependency. Why do some people long deeply for love, closeness, and emotional connection, yet begin pulling away the moment the relationship starts to feel too intense, too close, or too emotionally real? Yes, I understand that you can always, and it is convenient to blame the other person, and I'm sure they're not without their faults. But you could blame the other person for why you're pulling away. But what I'm going to encourage you to consider is that needing another person can sometimes feel exposing, humiliating, entrapping, or even dangerous. So often in these relational dynamics, the problem is not the absence of a feeling. It is the fear of dependency, vulnerability, and what it means to emotionally need another person. Today, through a prototypical example, we're going to explore the difference between, and I quote, healthy and unhealthy dependency, and why you, or someone you know, may feel the need to preserve the emotional, and I quote, exit strategies out of a fear of dependency. There's a lot to cover here, as usual, so let's get right into this. I often think it's helpful to begin with a lived experience because these dynamics are often much easier to recognize emotionally. In other words, many people can understand the concept of, again, I quote, fear of dependency on a cognitive or intellectual level, but have a much harder time recognizing what it actually looks like and feels like when it begins unfolding inside of a relationship. So let's start with a prototypical example. Imagine someone coming into therapy week after week, describing how wonderful their new relationship feels. They feel alive again, excited, connected. They talk about feeling understood and hopeful about the future. Maybe for the first time in years, they begin imagining a life with somebody else. Then something shifts. Perhaps they spend more time with their partner's family. Maybe they become increasingly aware of differences in wealth, status, confidence, achievement, intellect, or you could fill in the blank here, perhaps lifestyle. Again, but you could fill it in terms of whatever may be relevant to you in terms of recognizing something. Then suddenly, something begins shutting down inside of them. They feel like they, and I quote, cannot do this anymore, or that they need space. They begin emotionally pulling away, often without fully understanding why. It's only later, through reflection and exploration, that we begin recognizing the underlying feelings of intimidation, exposure, inadequacy, or psychological smallness that had initially remained outside of awareness. What I typically hear in the consulting room is something like this. I don't know. Something changed. I just feel like I need space. Maybe we're moving too fast. Maybe this relationship is not the right one for me. They start questioning the relationship. The goal is to create psychological distance. And sometimes they even start talking about, and again I quote, putting the relationship on pause. So what's actually happening psychologically when someone suddenly needs an exit strategy? So what begins to happen from a psychodynamic perspective? As we slow this process down, the need to preserve, and again I quote because I hear this frequently, an out starts becoming much more understandable. Keeping an emotional escape route often protects a person from feelings that they experience as deeply uncomfortable or even dangerous, and they can include but are not limited to vulnerability, humiliation, dependency, and rejection. In this particular example, withdrawal was not simply about, and I quote, losing feelings for his partner. If anything, the feelings had become too emotionally significant. The relationship had started activating fears of inadequacy, asymmetry, and I emphasize that word, asymmetry, and we'll dwell on that in a moment, and emotional dependency that were difficult to tolerate consciously. Psychodynamically, the sequence often looks a little like this. First, there's an attraction, not only to the person, but to what the relationship represents emotionally. Then, in the prototypical example that we're discussing, something very specific happens. It is about what occurs when he comes into contact with, and I quote again, asymmetry. When he experiences her as confident, or in her family system, there's a certain sense of status, or he recognizes her wealth, or even her emotional stability as greater than his own. In other words, something inside of him begins to shift when he recognizes anything that can indicate this asymmetry. The relationship no longer feels like a mutual space. It begins to feel uneven. For example, the unconscious logic may start to sound something like this. If she's more confident than I am, more successful than I am, more emotionally stable, then what role do I occupy in this relationship? Am I supposed to depend on her? Am I supposed to lean on her or need something from her? What begins as admiration gradually transforms into a painful awareness of one's own perceived inadequacies. The asymmetry itself becomes psychologically threatening because it creates the possibility of dependency. What if I can't afford the things she enjoys and she wants to pay? The deeper conflict often creates and centers around dependency, about needs. The inner logic, again, often sounds like this. If I need something from you that I cannot fully provide for myself, then I become vulnerable. I become exposed. I become susceptible to disappointment, rejection, or humiliation. The more valuable the relationship becomes, the greater the potential injury if that relationship were ever withdrawn. So, in other words, let me say that again. As the relationship becomes more valuable, it's not that he suddenly loses his interest, but there's a greater potential for injury. So, what is the solution here when this inner logic begins to play out? If I never fully depend on you, then I never have to confront the anxiety of needing you. You could see how that could be a solution, right? Never fully depend on somebody. Then you don't have to feel anxious. If I keep one foot out the door, right, that's the exit strategy, I can avoid the terrifying possibility that my emotional well-being has become linked to someone else's presence or availability. I hope I'm beginning to demonstrate that what appears on the surface as a loss of interest is often something quite different. The relationship has begun to matter enough that dependency, vulnerability, and fears, perhaps of inadequacy, can no longer remain outside of awareness. Distance helps. Remember I said, so what's the solution? The solution, or one solution, is distance. Distance helps restore a sense of autonomy, self-protection, and psychological control. The implicit rule often becomes, and I quote, "I should not feel small. I should not feel uncertain. And I definitely should not feel dependent or needy," often said with quite a bit of disdain. Now, this raises an important question. If dependency can feel so dangerous to some people, what actually makes dependency healthy versus unhealthy? In other words, what could be some healthy solutions? One of the biggest misunderstandings in our society is the idea that emotional health means becoming completely independent. But what about healthy dependency? What does that actually look like? Healthy dependency, in this prototypical example, would mean being able to encounter that asymmetry without collapsing into it. It would mean being able to feel the pull of comparison, intimidation, or need for, in this example, her emotional steadiness, and still remain engaged rather than needing to withdraw. It would mean he could recognize, I feel small right now, without that feeling immediately becoming a signal that the relationship itself is unsafe and that he needs to get away from it immediately. In other words, healthy dependency allows you to need another person without feeling diminished by that need. It allows movement between connection and autonomy without any kind of emotional breakdown or rupture. In this state, the relationship becomes a secure base, not a site for humiliation or danger when, for instance, she knows something he does not know, or wants to purchase something for them that he cannot afford. The relationship becomes a place where you need others without feeling diminished or feeling castrated by said need. What's interesting is that the person in our prototypical example is organized around avoiding dependency. Yet, at the opposite end of the spectrum, we find a very different problem. Dependency becomes so overwhelming that the individual cannot tolerate separateness at all. Instead of pulling away when confronted with asymmetry, imagine, in the example we're exploring, he becomes increasingly attached to it. In other words, her confidence begins regulating his self-esteem. Her emotional steadiness becomes necessary for him to feel calm. Her approval becomes necessary for him to feel vulnerable. Rather than thinking, I need to get away from this relationship, I need my way out, the unconscious fantasy becomes, I need to stay connected to this relationship at all cost. I can't function without it. Instead of avoiding dependency, you collapse into it. Or in this case, he surrenders to it and turns over his functioning to her. The relationship gradually shifts from being a source of connection to becoming a source of emotional regulation. His sense of security, worth, stability, and identity become increasingly organized around her presence. In this version of the story, when he becomes insecure about depending, for example, on her status or her wealth, in other words, remember, she wanted to buy them something. In this version, he immediately turns to her for reassurance that it's going to be okay, that he needs her to constantly reassure him. Without realizing it, he makes her responsible for regulating his own conflicted emotions around dependency. This is another way unhealthy dependency presents itself. She becomes a structure that carries emotional functions that he struggles to perform internally, independently. In severe forms of this, the partner is unconsciously experienced not simply as a loved person, but as a stabilizer of one's self-esteem, a protection, and a regulator of overwhelming emotion. So, what we just witnessed are two extremes. That's what I'm trying to detail here. At one end is the person who cannot tolerate needing anyone and withdraws whenever dependency needs emerge. At the other end is the person who cannot tolerate separateness and becomes organized around preserving attachment at all cost. Healthy dependency occupies the middle ground between these two extremes and therefore allows for genuine intimacy. The goal, ultimately, is not to eliminate dependency. The goal is to transform your relationship into healthy dependency. In many ways, this brings us back to the central conflict at the heart of narcissism. Perhaps one of the central developmental challenges in narcissism is becoming able to experience dependency without experiencing oneself as diminished by it. To experience a need, to need another person without feeling humiliated, to admire another person's strengths without experiencing them as evidence of your own weakness or your own inadequacy. To tolerate, again, back to this word, asymmetry, without collapsing into defensiveness, shame, envy, withdrawal, or submission. Much of narcissistic functioning can be understood as an effort to avoid precisely these experiences. Psychological growth involves developing the capacity to remain emotionally present in these moments of need. So the goal is to remain present in these moments, to need, to receive, and to depend without experiencing oneself as less than. As always, there's so much more to say about this topic. As I'm sitting here thinking about wrapping this up, I find myself wanting to go further. I want to talk to you about the grandiose self. Remember, that's the structure that holds the narcissist together. I want to talk to you about the illusion of self-sufficiency and how so much of narcissistic functioning can be understood as an attempt to manage dependency and vulnerability. But perhaps we'll save that discussion for a future episode. If this topic resonated with you, or if you'd like to hear more about healthy and unhealthy dependency, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out. My email, as always, is in the show notes below. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, bye for now.